Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Catherine Mooney, and I have the honor to be the James P. Jones Associate Professor of History at Florida State. I'm speaking to you virtually from Bellamy Hall, which the room behind me was Jim's final classroom at FSU, and it was my first in the fall of 2014 when I came to FSU to replace him. Though about 5 minutes after I arrived, it became very clear that replacing him was not something that was humanly possible. And the best thing you could do was to model yourself on his example. And I still remember walking into this room the first day I taught in it, and I put my papers down on the table that is behind me, and I looked down and there was a circle drawn in black magic marker on the wall under the light switches. And I was thinking about other things, and I sort of assumed vaguely that it had something to do with maintenance, and I moved on with my life, and it just became part of my classroom. And it was not until months later that I learned that Jim had drawn that circle during his final term in this room. And the reasons why are not important. They're connected to a classic Jim story that I would be glad to tell you off air. But the important thing and the comforting thing for me over the last several months has been the knowledge that from the very first moment I walked into a classroom at this institution, Jim was with me. And so it has been a great honor to help to plan this event. And when I say help, I mean help, because this event as it exists would be completely impossible without the very hard work and the great graciousness of Claudia Liebeskind, Heather Athey, Kurt Rockenstein, Matt Strange, Marina Ortiz, Ben Goff, and Matt McClin. And I thank you personally so much for what you have done for all of us. And I would like to thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank those folks who wanted to come but had to send their regrets. I heard from people in the class of 1964 and people in the class of 2013. And I also had a lot of other messages. And I think in a way, the invitation opened up for people this place where they felt they could put on record how good a man Jim Jones was. They wanted to write it down, and they wanted somebody by God to read it. And I became the person who received those messages. And that is one of the great honors of my whole career, I think. I heard from a father who said that Jim had been his favorite teacher and his kids' favorite teacher. I heard from a former student who I know might speak for many of you, who said that he took his first class with Jim. He got a C+ on his first test. He was very upset about it, and he went to the office. Jim took one look at the test and said, "Oh, yeah, this is one of the worst tests I have ever seen." And then sat him down, walked him through it, and he said, "I never got less than an A in a history class after that, and I became a history teacher." And finally, I got a message from another former student. And it was really just 2 sentences, but it's the last sentence that really sticks with me. And he said, "Jim deserves all the recognition that can be given." And so as we try to do that, we have invited several people here today who loved him and whom he loved. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Philip Morgan, Ms. Deb Herman, Dr. Andrew Zwilling, Colonel Matt Morton, and of course, Ms. Nancy Jones. They're going to speak to us, and then many of you have been gracious enough to give us some of your pictures to document your memories of Jim, and so we'll get a chance to look at those as well. But for now, I'd like to turn this over to Jim's great friend, Dr. Philip Morgan, Harry C. Black Professor of History at Johns Hopkins.
Thank you, Kathy. Jim was the most multifaceted, inquisitive person I've ever met. There were so many dimensions to him: historian, teacher, opera buff, music lover, literary aficionado, sports fan, worldwide traveler, museum goer, battlefield tour, gardener, political guru, philanthropist, railway enthusiast, a husband a few times over, a devoted father to Nancy, and so much more. He was at home in both high and low brow culture, listening to rarefied classical music one minute, composing witty, pointed limericks the next. He was a voracious reader, from novels to box scores, from John Buchan to A.S. Byatt. There was almost nothing that failed to spark his curiosity. Basically, he liked people. He took an interest in others' lives. It's one reason students flocked to his door. They intuited that he cared about them. He understood the meaning of empathy. Jim was the first in his family to go to college. My hunch is that he wondered whether he really belonged and overcompensated by learning as much as possible in many arenas as possible. He had a real thirst for knowledge. As an undergraduate, he attended Oxford College of Emory University, perhaps accounting for his lifelong Anglophilia. He began his doctoral studies at UCal Berkeley under the daunting and formidable gaze of the distinguished historian Kenneth Stamp. He didn't last long. He experienced an earthquake and one night almost died of gas poisoning. He came home to Florida, his native state, to complete his PhD. Part of Jim's complexity was that he suffered from depression. He could go into the deepest of funks, plumbing the depths of despair. But he would eventually surface back to his sparkling, scintillating best. Even though he experienced many ailments in his later years and railed against the ravages of old age, he was actually less depressed over time. He was generally in good spirits in his last few years. A firm believer in creative chaos, he didn't keep an ordered, tidy office. That's an understatement. Papers lay in disarray on all available surfaces, but somehow he kept track of what was important. He generally ignored bureaucratic demands on his time. He had little truck either with educational theory. He likened good teaching to hitting a baseball. Don't get obsessed by the mechanics, he would say. Just go up there and make contact. Jim loved to document, to list, and to count, whether it was the number of students he had taught, Civil War battlefield casualties, the teaching awards that he'd won, the music albums he owned, baseball statistics. Jim was well ahead of his time in his progressive views. He had many gay friends when few were out of the closet. He remained a staunch supporter of a married colleague who left the university accused of a homosexual encounter. He gave generously to civil rights causes when they were deeply unpopular. He donated money to the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra because it had a gay maestro as its conductor. When the COVID-19 crisis hit, Jim typically wrote a generous check to the Cool Cafe in support of its staff. Most of all, I treasure the memories of our good times together. The next time I go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York and see Bruegel's The Harvesters, I will think of Jim. The next Met Opera I see, I will think of Jim. The next time I watch a Manchester United game, I will think of Jim. The next time Barbara and I visit Tommy Warren and Kathy Villacorta, especially at St. Teresa, we'll think of Jim. The next time I hear of a historian's bizarre foibles, I'll think of Jim composing a limerick to memorialize the event. The next time Donald Trump commits one more idiocy, I won't have to wait long on that score, I will think of Jim excoriating him. In fact, few aspects of human existence will not bring Jim to mind because he was so full of life himself. I miss him terribly.
Thank you. That's very much how I feel. Now I'd like to introduce Ms. Deb Herman, the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, where Jim continued his teaching career after he left Florida State. And I'm sure there's part of Jim that is holding it over all of us that he died on semester break. So he never actually stopped teaching.
Thank you, Catherine. Jim Jones was a teacher of history whose own record reached historic proportions. He taught traditional students full-time for 57 years, but that wasn't enough for Jim. After he retired in 2014, and he hadn't had enough of teaching, and in 2015, then he took on a new kind of students, the non-traditional ones, learners over 50 who weren't looking for degrees or credentials or career boost, students who didn't need grades or exams or required reading to keep them motivated. These students, who were all members of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at FSU, took courses in a wide variety of subjects simply because they loved to learn, and they loved Jim. Jim came to Ollie through the efforts of Susan Yelton, a past Ollie president and chair of the curriculum committee at the time. Susan first met Jim when she was an undergraduate at FSU in 1962. They became friends then and remained in touch through the years. And 53 years later, after Susan took that first class with Jim, she was once again his student. And Susan wasn't the only Ollie student who had had Jim as an instructor decades ago. It was a real treat for those FSU alumni to experience Jim's unique approach once again. And it was also a real treat for our Ollie students who hadn't had the Jim Jones experience. Susan said he was Ollie's most popular faculty member. She said, people took his classes knowing the subject matter, but took his classes because he was Jim Jones. He created a history for us that took us back into time with his incredible knowledge. I felt that taking one of Jim's classes was like listening to a movie. He would sing and recite poems from memory at times. He held our attention so well, you could hear a pin drop during his lectures. And our students just couldn't get enough of Jim. Between 2015 and 2020, he taught 15 classes for Ollie and often told us that teaching Ollie classes was keeping him going. Even as his health deteriorated, he kept teaching. We had hoped he'd make it to 90. That's what he told me he wanted to do, but that wasn't to be. You won't be surprised to hear that Jim taught classes on the Civil War and World War II, and a course on Winston Churchill would seem like a natural. But Jim went beyond expectations. With his passion for sports, especially baseball, he also taught a course called Movie, Sports, and Social Issues. And he offered a class on Watergate based on the movie All the President's Men. And he called it All the President's Men and Me. But I suspect you'll be as surprised as I was when Jim wanted to teach a class on Girl Detective Nancy Drew. As a person who had been concerned about civil liberties for his entire life, he wanted to point out the racism in that beloved series. He had read the series as a child and had published an article back in 1971 in the Journal of Negro Education titled Negro Stereotypes in Children's Literature, The Case of Nancy Drew. I said, okay, go for it. And he did. And his lecture was another slam dunk. And we're looking forward to making it available for viewing in the near future. Up until early last spring, when the pandemic disrupted our Ollie classes, Jim was still offering his insight, his wisdom, his thoughts to hundreds of students. So many that we had to find extra large lecture halls in the community to accommodate the crowds. You all know about Jim's salty language. Well, I went to Temple Israel to ask if their sanctuary would be available for Jim's lectures. I also made sure that the rabbi knew that Jim's language wasn't always the most appropriate for a religious venue. Fortunately, I was assured that it wouldn't be a problem. Jim was known for his generosity of spirit. He was open to questions and comments, both in class and beyond. He loved the interaction with his students, and they loved their interaction with him. I thought you might like to hear just a few of the many compliments and comments our students offered on Jim's courses. Wish I had learned history from a master like this when I was a kid. Wonderful instructor. He hasn't changed much since I took a class from him in 1962. And as an aside, I looked at his scant notes one time and I thought they must be from 1962 as well. Another comment, if Dr. Jones taught a course on the phone book, I'd take it. Wonderful presentation of history. Wish I had classes like this when I was in school. And can't wait until next semester. Indeed a legend. Jim's course evaluation files are packed with notes like these, and he was interested in reading each of them. Jim's classes attracted a wide variety of students, and many took his classes more than once, just to savor the expertise and the experience. Among the most prominent was the late FSU president, Sandy Dallenbert, who was often found sitting in Jim's classes next to his wife, Patsy Palmer. I somehow imagine Jim and Sandy sitting together somewhere behind the pearly gates, having rousing discussions of history, civil rights, sports, and all the other passions and concerns that they both shared as gifted intellects and lifelong learners. Wouldn't we all love to be in on those conversations? We miss Jim terribly. He was beloved by his students, and he dedicated his life to education. For Ollie, it is truly the end of an era.
That whole experience meant so much to him that when he said it was keeping him going, that was true. And I know we're all looking forward to hearing about Nancy Drew. I understand it was a real showstopper. and I didn't get to see it live, so I'm really looking forward to bringing my popcorn and seeing it on video. I'd like to now turn this over to Dr. Andrew Zwilling of the U.S. Navy War College. Andy and his wife Megan were two of Jim's favorite people on the planet.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Zwilling, and I've been given the opportunity to speak to you about Jim as a representative of the students he had over the years. This is both a great honor and incredibly humbling. As Jim would have absolutely told you, he had more than 21,000 students over the course of his career, my wife Megan and I included. But what always surprised me was his ability to remember the students from decades before. It was not a rare occurrence to have someone tell him that their parents or grandparents or both took the exact same class with him decades before. Jim would even remember their names and how well they did in the class. On more than one occasion, he would recount what a student wrote in an essay more than 30 years before and what grade he gave it. First and foremost, Jim was my dear friend. A friend who I desperately wish I could have one more phone call or share one more meal with. I would even listen to his Jim Morrison stories for the 30th time if it meant getting to see him again. And that's a sentiment I'm sure that is shared by all of you. But I also had the privilege of having Jim as a professor for my undergraduate and graduate degrees. He was the advisor for my master's thesis and served on my dissertation committee. As an undergraduate, he taught me the value of a good lecture. There was a reason why his classes were constantly over capacity and students would beg to be added. The narratives he wove with just a simple list of key terms and maybe a map, it was incredible. His teaching was a big reason about why I pursued graduate work in history. And the first time Dr. Jones flipped me the bird in class, I was hooked. For those of you who might not know, that was one of the ways that you could tell if he liked you. If he cursed at you or he flipped you off, you were in good with him. As a graduate student, I came to truly appreciate why Jim was such a good professor. It wasn't just that he cared for his students. That much was obvious. But he also cared about the classes themselves and the subject matter. I knew Jim during the last 2 decades of his life, and by then he had taught many of his classes dozens of times. If anyone had the right to just put their feet up and coast by, it was him. But he never did that. He would continually read newly published books and update his lecture notes. When you went into his house, there'd be multiple towers of books next to the couch, always changing depending on when you went. He never stopped trying to improve his teaching. He also still got nervous on the first lecture day of class, despite decades of experience. This amazed me. I was supposed to be getting nervous. I was the new guy, not him. But in hindsight, this was another indicator of exactly how much he cared about what he did. Finally, he was both kind and patient to his students, as I found out firsthand. I was not the best writer when I started graduate school, nor did I ever remember to put page numbers on the bottom of my papers. He patiently worked with me as my writing improved over the years and gave me encouragement, the encouragement I needed to improve. Unfortunately, I never actually learned how to put the page numbers on the assignments, and more than once I'd be walking by his office and a paper would be thrown at me out of the door, and he'd yell at me, "Put on the damn page numbers." I'm certain many of you have your own stories of Jim Jones as a professor, and I urge you to share those stories. Please email me. I would love to hear them, and I would love to keep his memory alive. But I'm going to end today telling you what I'm going to cherish most about Jim Jones, my friend. I will remember meeting every Thursday night at Wine Loft for drinks and appetizers for years. I'll remember the long drives and monthly dinners at Liam's in Thomasville, the reading he gave at our wedding, and how he helped me plan my honeymoon. How he was caring, emotional, quick-witted, and so damn smart. I loved my friend, and I will miss him dearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I think if it's any consolation, you would have dearly loved that. And now I'd like to turn this over to Colonel Matt Morton and thank him personally for being with Jim until the end. No one could have done it better.
Nancy, Debbie Perry, Professor Mooney, members of the Department of History, and friends of Professor Jones, thank you for allowing me to have just a few minutes today. Sitting at the end of all these conversations, there's nothing I can add to what we've heard already. Like all of you, Professor Jones had a profound impact on my personal life, the life of a couple of my children who went to Florida State, and the very trajectory of my career. The degrees I earned at Florida State were far more than any award or military decoration. Because of his direction and guidance, I can say that at the end of my career, I'm a soldier and still an aspiring scholar. And in this company, I emphasize the aspiring. But alone, that wouldn't merit the time that I've been afforded today. I wanted to wear my uniform today to remind a larger audience of how much Professor Jones contributed to something even bigger than the wider Florida State community. Its graduates and practicing educators. Professor Jones had a large and lasting impact on the United States Army, and specifically the Department of History at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Many of you will recall, because we've heard it already today, how at the end of the semester he would get up in front in what we would call in the military his running estimate, where he would recount how many students he taught and how many classes he taught, as a way of welcoming yet another small cohort into this ever-enlarging inner circle that is gathered here today, former students of a legend. And by my own running estimate, that I helped pull together with a colleague who's at West Point now and on the line, it's revealed that Professor Jones served on the dissertation committees of no less than 16 Army officers, destined for assignments at West Point. During their instructor tours at the Academy, these Florida State graduates taught at least 350 cadets. Among other things, the cadets studied the American Civil War and World War II, subjects Professor Jones had led us through during our brief stays in Tallahassee. But what Professor Jones taught us about these wars wasn't nearly as important as the man he became every time he stepped behind the lectern. Each of us in Professor Jones had a role model for what it means to teach with passion, passion that can infect the most ahistorical West Point cadet, Army major, or young colonel here at the War College, with an interest in history they did not have when they arrived in the classroom. Some of the officers Professor Jones instructed have returned to West Point for second and third tours as members of the permanent faculty. Others went on to teach at the Staff College, and I'm finishing up my career here at the Army War College at Carlisle Barracks. So as you can see, 350 cadets per instructor is the tip of a very large iceberg that one day is going to reach into the most senior ranks of the Army. As I promised Professor Mooney, my remarks would be brief, in stark contrast to the duration of the influence Professor Jones is going to have on the Army, my colleagues, who are also officers, our students, and me. I can't thank you enough for allowing me to participate in today's event. And like you all, I miss him dearly.
Thank you, Matt. He would have been very glad for you to be here. And he would have said thank you for all the pictures of the kids he had on the refrigerator from you. And finally, I'd like to turn this over to Nancy Jones, who so graciously shared her father with us for so many years.
Hello, my name is Nancy. In case you haven't guessed, I was named after Nancy Drew. There was another option for a first name. It was Carolyn for Carolyn Keene. And in case you didn't know, the reason that he ended up teaching the Nancy Drew class for Ollie is one day, for some bizarre reason, I couldn't remember something in a Nancy Drew and Googled it. And I got to this thing on Wikipedia, and it showed this one particular quote. And I looked at that quote and I thought, as I am my father's child, son of a bitch, I know that quote. I know who wrote it. And I looked down, and sure enough, in the footnotes was Dad's article, and not the one for the Negro Education, but the one that was published a few years later in the Journal of Popular Culture. And all the other articles that were written about Nancy Drew afterwards all referred to my dad's article, which I thought was absolutely wonderful. I mean, granted, he has great fame as a teacher and great fame as a writer, but little did he know that Nancy Drew was going to get him fame in Wikipedia and in footnotes in every Nancy Drew article everywhere. So I came home, or actually I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, "You're not gonna believe this," and started reading him some of the things in the Wikipedia article and some of the arguments with some of his ideas. And he said, "God damn it, I can't believe it." And I said, "So do you think you might want to teach the class again?" And he said, "Yes, I think I ought to teach a class in Nancy Drew." And I said, "Good." So that's how you ended up with a class on Nancy Drew. And I have heard parts of that, which to me are just wonderful. And some of them are absolutely hilarious. And to this day, when I read his old Nancy Drews, as a matter of fact, I am working on The Hidden Staircase right now, which I read before I go to bed. His notes and little margin, jottings are in there, which are absolutely wonderful. I also wanted to say that the only reason I am here is because Dad saved my life when I was 4. When I was a kid, we were down in Panama and we had gone for a picnic, and there's this particular fruit called a mamone, which is maybe about this big around and has a seed that's about that big, but they taste really good. Well, I swallowed the mamone seed and started choking. And at that point, there wasn't a Heimlich maneuver. There wasn't even a Heimlich gesture. So Dad picked me up by my feet and just shook the daylights out of me, and out plopped the mamone seed. His love and concern for me never ended. And he was like that all of his life. For many years, when I was in school, I had a roommate, Susan Rouse, and she was also friends with Dad, and people would talk about how the 3 of us had our own private language. because it was based on the movies that we all watched, the music that we all listened to, the fiction, the nonfiction that we all read, and phrases from Grandma Jones, who was also a huge influence on all of us. In many ways, not because of the breadth of everything that we all wanted to learn, because Grandma read everything. She read literature, she read history, she taught herself Latin, she taught herself Italian, she listened to operas. And she meant so much to all of us, and especially with her love of opera, which Dad got, and so did Susan, and of course I have it as well, except for the Rosenkavalier, and we still disagree on that one. Dad, you would think, somebody who was sort of a jock, and he would play with all of his friends. And on Saturdays, Grandma would come out and say, okay, it's time to come listen to the opera. You would think that a kid that had, all these jock friends would be making fun of him for going to listen to the opera. Well, one time Grandma came out there and they were playing basketball, and she said, oh, I used to play basketball. Grandma was a frail woman. You might know that she only had 3/4 of a lung due to tuberculosis. And she said, yes, I used to play basketball. And they all said, oh, yeah, right. So somebody dribbled the basketball to her. She picked it up, put it on her finger, spun it, shot it, nothing but net. After that, all of his friends worshiped the ground that she walked on and never said anything bad to listen to the opera. Another thing that Dad got from Grandma was the gift of concern for others. One of Dad's friends when he was a kid was a very smart boy, but very poor, and from a family also where nobody had ever gone to college, but they weren't like Grandma. They didn't read Kierkegaard just for the fun of it. And let me tell you, that is not easy. Or Heidegger's What is a Thing, or various things along those lines. And so Grandma was talking to Dad, about going to school, in college and everything. And she turned to this boy and said, so where are you going to college? And he said, I'm not going to college, ma'am. I don't have the money to do that. I'm not bright enough to go to college. And she said, yes, you are bright enough, and you may not have the money, but there's scholarships, and we're sending you to college. He ended up going to college. He ended up being an officer, high-ranking officer, I believe, in the U.S. Navy, and then went on to run a business. He and Dad still talked once a year, and every time they talked, he would always thank Dad for being his friend and Grandma for getting him through college. And, seeing to it that A, he got there, and B, that he got all the way through college, because it was her help and assistance that really allowed that to happen. And that's how Dad got a lot of his way of living. Grandpa was the same way. He was very helpful to, all of the people that he worked with on the railroad. And that's just something that Dad learned at his mother's and father's knee. He learned love of opera from Grandma and love of baseball from Grandpa, and trains, because they would take the trains and go to St. Louis and watch the Cardinals. And there was nothing that made him happier than going to St. Louis and watching the Cardinals and any other baseball that he could see in between them. I was also going through, Dad was, talk about keeping lists, and then there were always the notebooks, and there were notebooks all over the house. And as I went through them, I found one, pardon me, where he had written his own obituary. And this is what it said. Jim Jones retired in May 2014 from FSU. After 57 years in the classroom, he taught Civil War history 93 times. Jim has published 6 books on the history of the Civil War. Best known are a 2-volume biography of Union General John A. Logan and a work called Yankee Blitzkrieg about the Union cavalry raid, his handwriting wasn't the best, across Alabama and Georgia in 1865. Jim has 57 years of teaching at FSU and taught 21,290 students and won 9 teaching awards. That was all he said. It is perfect in some ways because it covers the facts, but it's imperfect in many ways because of the relationship that he developed with all of his students and all of his friends. And one that might end up being a better one is when he won his, when he had his celebration for teaching for 50 years, one of his former students, Max Friedman, wrote a note, and I think this captures Dad better than anything on earth. It was spring and Jim was just back from a peregrination to New York City where he went to 16 operas in a week, I think, or was a weekend, and longed for more. Half of them were by Wagner. Stilling had a way of reporting it and that made such an experience actually sound pleasurable, the way he can make you feel like you might want to try crossing the Mongolian desert in a Jeep and sleep in a yurt. How was it? I asked. Wonderful, Jim said. I just love that part in the third act where Elsa and Lohengrin are telling each other how much they love each other, and it's so fucking beautiful. And she's singing to him and he's singing to her, and then Elsa blows it all and says, and by the way, what the hell's your name? Then in rushes that son of a bitch Telemann, and they start fighting, and all goes straight to hell. And you know it's coming because you've seen it so many times, but it just still gets you every goddamn time. The you is him, of course, because Jim has seen Lohengrin so many damn times and relished them all as he seems to relish everything in life, going after it at full speed and living at least twice as hard as the rest of us. He has traveled so damn far and taught so damn many students and married so damn many women. And now he has taught for 50 goddamn years. Those young people who found themselves in his classes or showed up on a tip must have felt when he started teaching that they were being lifted right up by their lapels like a junior member of Congress getting the Johnson treatment from the Speaker of the House, or like being blown back by a gale force wind. And many of them immediately discovered for the first time that they find history captivating and important because Jim found history captivating and important. Oscar Wilde almost got it right when he said that anybody can make history, only a great man can write it. Jim has shown 20,000 young people what happened to history when a great man tells it. Because Jim approaches history the way he does everything, from the ravenous consumption of high culture to energetically chewing out the Bush administration to friendship. And that's why all of us are so goddamn lucky to know him. I loved him very, very much, and I miss him terribly. I think of him all the time, and I thank you so much for everything that you all have done. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. And with that, I will let Catherine Mooney close this session.
Thank you, Nancy. I think those of us that had made it thus far without breaking down, you did us in. So certainly did me in. And now many of you were kind enough to share your photographs with us. And we'd like to show them now, especially because we haven't seen Jim yet. And I think I'd really like to see him at this event. thank you to all of you who contributed photographs to that. We will be seeking to put together a larger digital memorial that will be attached to the History Department website. And to echo Andy's call, we would love to have people's recollections, their photographs, their videos, whatever you have that could go into such a digital memorial. We'll be in touch about that in the next few weeks. We're also making some plans about a physical memorial on campus and what that might look like, since, as many of you know, Jim largely regarded the internet as a place to look for rare vinyl and look up things on Rate My Professors, which he really, I think, regarded as his personal website on which he allowed other people occasionally to appear. And so those are the memorial plans in process at this point. Thank you so much to all of you for coming today. Thank you very, very much to our speakers. And please join me in a toast to a really, really good man. I love you, Jim.